All right, so we're going to get started today, and today starts to be fun because we get to really install some actual environments. We get to play with sun, and this is when your renderings really start to look a lot better. There is, however, another side of it that we won't cover today. That'll be next lecture. So we're going to do two back-to-back environment lectures on Vri for Rhino. And so today's the first half. We'll get a bunch of stuff relating to sun, and then we'll take it a step further. But this is the step you guys have been waiting for as part of the rendering process, because finally glass will look like glass, and skies will look like skies, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to walk through exercise 215. There are some changes from the handout that I gave you, and I'm going to do things slightly in a different order. And I really should have changed the order because I've found today that my computer likes to crash during a few of these steps. So we're going to skip those steps and do it slightly differently, and then I'll try live to see if I can do it where it doesn't crash. But I don't make those promises, so we're going to at least get through the part that I want to get through before we attempt the crash part. So first off, we want to start envisioning our file structure such that we have nested blocks, and we're going to use those to keep our building separate from our environment. And this will be something that thematically will happen as we go forward. We're always going to be keeping our final render file that has environment and lights and that sort of thing separate from the model file, because it'll save a lot in computer processing power, etc. And we're going to use blocks to our advantage. So I'm going to take the building that I did last class, so it's this one here, that has its floors and its elevator core and its skin, and I'm going to go ahead and copy that into a brand new Rhino file. And when I do that, instead of going to the transform copy, I'm going to go over to the edit copy. And so I'll go to edit and then copy. It's copying this geometry to the clipboard, which means I can transfer it to another file. So it's not moving it within the file itself. It's moving it to a new file. And then I'll go ahead and go to File and then New. Large objects inches, except that I messed up my template last class. So I'm going to do large object feet and then convert it to inches using the units command to make sure that I am in inches. That was a mistake on my end here. All right. So now that I'm in units, in inches as my units, I'm going to go ahead and go to the edit menu and then paste. And it will then drop my file in place. I'm going to zoom selected in perspective and also in each of these other views. And in the perspective view, I'm going to go ahead and view it as a shaded piece. So this building then, I'm also going to move it so that it is exactly on 0.00. So I'm going to type move, pick one corner, and then go 0, 0, 0 to make sure that it is at the origin, because I'm going to use it as a block long term. And before I do anything more with it, let's make sure it's in all views. There we go. I can see it everywhere. And I'm going to go through my layer structure and make sure that it's set up in a clean way that will come in with the block for my own benefit. So let's go ahead, and I have a floors layer, I have a ceilings layer, and I have a skin layer. All of those are important. I'm going to get rid of these control curves. I don't need them anymore. And again, since this is a separate file, I feel safe in doing that. I'm also going to create a layer called skyscraper. And that layer will then take these three, the floors, the ceilings, and the skin, and we'll put them as sub-layers to the skyscraper layer. So again, I'm trying to organize. Then I'm going to go through and get rid of all the rest of these layers, including the default layer. And so now I'm working on the floors, the ceilings, and the skin. I also want to make sure that my layers have their materials assigned to them correctly. So first off, I'm going to make sure that I go into my materials and that concrete loads. So I had these assigned last class, But if my files have moved or my flash drive isn't in the right place, something like concrete might not show up because it's missing its map files. If I click on concrete and click preview, as long as I still see it, we're OK. I used the glass light skyscraper as my skyscraper glass. If I preview that, that's still there. And I used the sheetrock as my ceiling. If I preview that, that's still there. All three of those materials have been assigned to my skyscraper layers on their appropriate layers. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the floors and the ceilings for just a second so that I have just the skin assigned. And this is where I'm deviating from the handout. In the handout under Part 1, Step 2, I ask you to create a secondary surface. We're not going to use true glass. We're going to use this fake skyscraper glass, which I think is will give us better results and doesn't have to have thickness. If we used regular basic glass as our skyscraper glass, we would have to add thickness. Otherwise, Vri would render it as a solid glass object, not as a piece of glass on the outside of our object. So we're going to use the skyscraper glass and not worry about that step 2 where we're making a copy. But before I move into putting this into a scene, I do want to edit my texture mapping of this object. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to switch into rendered mode for a second. And I can see my object, but it's not really looking quite right. I'm seeing part of it as fully transparent. There's some weird lines going on, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and select my skin. And I'm going to come over to my properties. I'm going to go to texture mapping. And I'm going to add a box map. So even though this is twisted, it's still pretty much a box. So we're going to go ahead and add a box map. We'll say bounding box, world. We're going to cap it. And it now has a little bit of a different piece applied to it. If I were to render this, we'd get a slightly different result than what we're seeing in preview. And this is the case with rendering. Essentially, I have a little bit on the bottom of a piece of glass that's not as transparent as the upper section of glass. And what this works nicely as is if we adjust it to be on a specific interval. So I'm going to take my texture map, and I'm going to click on the Show Mapping button, which gives me this little box. And I'm going to transform this box to match up with the height of a floor and to be 4 feet by 4 feet. So let me go ahead and scale the mapping channel. So I'm going to type scale. My height, so from here to right there, I'm going to make 16 feet. You can start to see all the floors appear, right? And I'm going to make sure that I'm going to scale 1D now, so that from there to there is going to be 4 feet. And from there to there is also going to be 4 feet. And so you can start to see that it's dividing the glass up into these little segments, which is going to make the skyscraper feel a lot more real. The other thing that I want to do is I'm going to turn on my floors for just a second, and I'm going to move this mapping widget so that it starts not at the lobby level, but at the first actual floor. So there it is right there. Once I've done that, if I took a second and I rendered it, we can start to see that I have bands and I have intervals of windows that feel appropriate in scale. So the reason this whole thing works is because the skyscraper glass material itself, if we digest it, and I come, let's look at first at the diffuse, the color is set, it's not a map, but the transparency has a map. And if I look at the transparency map, we can see that it is more transparent on top, less transparent down below, and there's a little stripe of this less transparent that goes up the side, so that when it tiles, we have that less transparent at the bottom and going up the side. If we didn't like it, we could, of course, modify it. That then is scaled on the scale of the building so that we can start to see this repeating pattern. This will be a lot better when we get into a scene that has sun and environment and that sort of thing. So trust me for a little bit. But I've gone ahead and I've adjusted it. Why Rhino insists on previewing the less transparent as completely transparent, I don't know. But it is what it is. That's the way we're seeing it in our preview. So there it is with all of its floors. I'm going to go ahead and save this file. So I'll go to File and then Save As. And let's put it into today's folder, which is 215. And we'll call this Skyscraper. And this is spring of 2017. And I'll go ahead and save it. I can also choose to make the mapping widget go away. I'll go ahead and hide the mapping widget so it's gone. And now I'm set. I have my building. It's ready to bring into a scene. So I already have a scene for you to work with. If you go to the course website and you go to our exercise 215, about halfway down under part 2, I have a file called SF Downtown. This is going to be a building site and a bunch of buildings from San Francisco that you can work with. I did not create this file. It actually, I believe it came from the grad school at Berkeley. Somebody created it at some point. It's a nasty file. It's big. It's a mesh. It's ugly. But it would be a lot of work to create a new version. So we're just going with it. And so it's there for you guys to work with. If you click on it, instead of right-clicking to save, click on it. It'll take you to Dropbox. You don't have to sign up. You can say, no, I don't want to sign up. I don't want to log in. And you can download it from Dropbox. It's such a big file that I'd rather have Dropbox's servers give it to you than mine, because it would take a lot longer for mine to give it to you. So download it from there. I've already downloaded it because I didn't want to have you guys to have to wait. It'll take a couple minutes. It's like 60-something megabytes or 70 megabytes, something like that. So it's a little bit large as a file. So once you have it downloaded, you'll go ahead and open up that file. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File, Open. And we'll open up the, I thought I downloaded it. Hold on a second. I know I already downloaded it. Go to Downloads. Downloads. SF Downtown, there it is. Okay, so this is now San Francisco. If I zoom out for a second, and remember this is slow, so you have to be a little patient with it, you can see that we have a bunch of context. It's not perfect. It doesn't have the Bay Bridge in it. It's missing some pieces. Somewhere out there, there's some other versions that are floating around. If you find it, let me know, and we'll try to combine it together. So in this file, we have the really nasty mesh that I said it's slow. There we go. That's made up of a bunch of different meshes that overlap and whatever. I've gone ahead and I've prepped some stuff for you. So number one, we have the SF model. It's all on this purple layer. If you want things to move a little faster, you can turn it off, which leaves you with a very simple building site that is integrated into the SF model. So first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the SF model layers. So let's turn those back on. I'll right-click on SF model, and I'll say Select Objects. That will then select all of the meshes. I then am going to, let me zoom selected so you can see the whole context here. There it is. Okay, big city, or piece of the city. I'm going to take this, and I'm going to apply a material to it. And I think it might already have the material applied to it, but we're going to go through the exercise anyway. I'm going to go to Materials, and then in our scene materials, we're going to apply some kind of a white-gray type material. The reason that I do this is because we're not overemphasizing photorealism here. We're trying to cause people that are looking at your building to focus on your building. So one of the rendering strategies is, instead of making the backdrop photorealistic, we make the backdrop look as if it was just a 3D model. and then we concentrate on photorealism for your actual building. It works nicely in presentations. So I'm going to go ahead and assign all of this nasty mesh a white porcelain material. So we would go in and we would load material, go to your flash drive. White porcelain is one of the options that's there. It also happens to already be loaded. And if I preview it, it's showing up nicely. Has a little gloss to it. It ends up looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on it and apply the material to the SF model layer. There it is. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And there it is, applied. My building site itself, if we were to select this object instead, there we go. Select object. Let's zoom selected on just that piece. There it is. It sticks out just a little bit from the ground. I probably should put the white porcelain on it as well. So let's go ahead and go back to my materials. Let's apply the white porcelain to it. Apply material to layer, building site. There we go. It's on both of those. So now I have my building site. And this is, again, where I'm deviating from the list. I talk about proxy objects in part 2. Proxy objects are what keep causing crashes and whatever. So we're going to skip the proxy objects for now. I'll come back to it, see if I can make it work. Because it is actually useful. It's just not perfect right now. So what I need to do now is bring in the block of my skyscraper. So I'll go to File, and then I'm going to go to Insert, or I can go to Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. You'll get the same result in both cases. Control-I is the keyboard shortcut for that. So under this Insert, I'm going to browse for my skyscraper file, skyscraper 2017. And I'll open. And the rest of these are fine. I want a prompt for an insertion point. I want my scale to be uniform. I'm not changing scale at all. And my rotation, I'm going to leave this and rotate it after. Then I'll go ahead and say OK. And here comes the important options. So in this Insert File Options, we're obviously going to read the blocks from within the file. And right here under Block Definition Type, we're going to click Link. So I have to make sure I keep the original file intact in the same location, but this will dramatically lower the CPU power necessary. If we insert the building itself directly, a lot more complicated, things get challenging. So we're going to link it, and our layer style is going to be referenced. That's fine. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And when I do that, my building comes in. So it's not on axis, correct? But I can snap it to the building site right there. Now, if things get a little slow, remember we can just turn off the SF City model, get rid of the context, and then work to rotate our building into place. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to rotate around this point. It's not a 3D rotate. It's just a regular rotate. And I'll rotate, and I'll swing this around to right here. So assuming that you built your building on the 100 by 200 foot piece, you'll be able to drop it right into this particular scene and call it a day. So if we look over here at the layers, we see this grayed out layer. That represents my block. We can also see that it came in with skyscraper and it came in with concrete, texture, and glass. There's one other tricky thing about blocks, and that is that it sticks the block onto whatever layer is currently the active layer. So we can control it via the building site and this layer. I would like to create one new layer that's just called blocks. And I'm going to make sure that my block goes on the blocks layer. So let me change object layer, and now I can control it via the blocks layer as opposed to some other layer. It just helps in the cleanliness. So I have blocks. The blocks then has on the skyscraper. So there I am. We'll go ahead and turn back on the San Francisco model file. You can see it in our context there. And because it's challenging to establish a view here, I have a couple views that are already set for you. I have a perspective 1 and a perspective 2. So if I go to my set view and I choose perspective 1, we'll get a view at street level looking toward my building. And if I choose and do a set view perspective 2, I'll get a different view looking a little bit closer at my building itself. And I'll talk about how to change the output file so we see more of the height of the building as we go forward. Okay, so I'm going to leave it here at perspective 2. And now it's a matter of starting to establish and set up the V-Ray scene with an actual sun and actual light settings. Okay, so we've made it down to part 3 of this. Remember, I skipped a bunch of part 2, which had to do with the proxy object. We'll come back to that. And I'm going to start in on part 3. We're going to first establish a sun in this particular scene. So on the V-Ray toolbar here, the first option there is a button called Sun. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on that Sun button. And I get the Sun Angle Calculator dialog box. And by default, it's going to say the sun is on and I have manual control of it. I don't want manual control, so let's uncheck manual control. And now I have some more options here. So we have sun position, and you can see that I could actually adjust it. But before we do anything, I want to scroll all the way to the bottom, and under Find Place, I'm going to type San Francisco. And I'll click then on San Francisco, California. Obviously, we're rendering in San Francisco. It makes sense to choose San Francisco. Sometimes you'll be doing renderings, and the city that you're doing the rendering in isn't listed. In that case, you want to pick something close. So when we get to the final project of this class, one of the cabin locations is up in Tahoe. The closest city to where you're building is Carson City, Nevada. So you'll pick some city that's close by. So if we were doing it in Pleasant Hill, here, we just pick San Francisco. It's close enough. All right? So with San Francisco picked, I'm going to scroll back up, and currently it's in the middle of the night. And we can see it in our little map version that we're in the middle of the night. We don't want it to be the middle of the night. We want to change our time of day. So a couple things. One, right now it's daylight savings time. So we'll check the box for daylight savings time. And then we can drag to change the time of day. So I tend to like early in the morning or late in the afternoon. I think the lighting conditions are better. So I usually shoot for 9 to 9:30 or maybe 4:30, 5:30, something like that in the afternoon. And as I do this slider, you can see on the map here what parts of the world are in shadow, what parts are in sun. So it's visually helping you sort that out. You can also change the date and time to be a different day or time. So obviously we slid the time. The day is set to today for right now, and that's fine. Once we set the date and time, the sun position is set for us. So we know where it is, north, south, east, and west, and we know what the altitude of the sun is. So we have both of those set for us. And I'll go ahead and say OK. So the typical mistake at this point is you don't do anything. Because you say, oh, I set the sun. It's all set. You still have to put the sun into the scene. If we look at our command line, it's asking for a position. Where's that sun going to go? It doesn't matter where it goes other than it has to go into the scene itself. So for lack of something better, I'll put it right there on the corner of my building. And it'll show up. Unfortunately, it's blue, but there it is. And it looks like a directional light that you've already established before. It's a little bit different than that. It's a lot more high power. I'm going to go ahead with that sun and put it on its own layer so I can go back and select it later on. So let's create another new layer. I'm going to call this environment. And then I'll create a sublayer for environment called sun. And I will change the sun to be on the sun layer, which will allow me to turn it on and turn it off. So there it is, right there. I have my sun installed in the scene. So that's the first step. We have sun, we have a time of day. That's good. Then we're going to move on and create a sky in the background. We still, if we were to render right now, would have a black background or a white background if we changed it to being white. So we want there to be some sky. Today, of course, is a cloudy day, not a clear day, so I can't use that as a good example. But generally speaking, if we were to look out on a sunny, perfectly clear day, there's a gradient of blue. If you look straight up, it's a darker blue, and as it gets to the horizon, it gets a little bit lighter. We need to find a way of mimicking that in Rhino as well. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my V-Ray options. And here in the V-Ray option editor, I'm going to go to environment. This, by the way, is written out under Vri 8.18 Sky, so you can follow that as well. And so here in the environment settings, I have two different things that I'm going to control. Number one is called the reflection, refraction, or background. That's what we actually see. That's the color we see, or the clouds that we see, etc. And then there's also something called GI, or skylight. So in our world, there's a certain amount of light that's just ambient reflected light. If we had just a single sun and there was nothing reflected, we'd have pitch black shadows. But we don't. So we have reflected light that's happening as part of our environment. That is controlled using this skylight option. It's the reflected light that comes off the atmosphere and comes back to us. It's the bounce light. So we're going to mimic that as well as the background. So we're going to do two things. The first thing is on the GI skylight, we're going to click on the M button. And when we click on the M button, we're going to bring up, this looks just like a V-Ray texture map. Nothing different. And from here, instead of picking text bitmap, which we've done previously, we're going to scroll down and pick texsky. When we pick texsky, we have some options. You can see that here it is, default sky options. And it's asking for what is our sun. Default says no, none. We want to assign the sun we just created. And that sun is identified by this really long random string of numbers. So we'll just go ahead and click on that. And that then ties the sky to our particular sun. So if you change the time of day on the sun, the sky would change. It would get darker or lighter. If it was later, the sky would get darker. So we'll go ahead and tie the two together, and then I'll go ahead and say OK. Notice the lowercase m changes to a capital M. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the reflection or refraction background. We'll click on the M. We'll go to texsky. And we'll tie it to that long string of numbers, which is our sun. I'll go ahead and say OK. And I now have the environment set for the skylight or background and the skylight and the background. So now that I have both of those environment things set, there's one more piece of the puzzle that I have to establish. And this is why I can't have you do this right away, because we have to have you be a little bit more ready for it. And that is, if I were to walk outside and take a picture of bright sunlight, I would need to have a camera that would modulate how bright it is to get the proper exposure. Well, rendering, we have to do the same thing. I need a camera. And so under the camera setting, it's a different drawer, we're going to check the box for physical camera on. And as soon as that physical camera goes on, you see that one of my options is shutter speed. If you remember, those of you that took 135, we talked a lot about shutter speed. Shutter speed had to do with how long the exposure is for the particular camera. We can adjust how dark or light a photo is by adjusting the shutter speed. Generally, starting at 300 is a pretty good idea. You're in almost all likelihood going to be somewhere between 100 and 300 when you do your rendering. So we'll turn the physical camera on, we'll set the shutter speed at 300, and then we're ready to do a test rendering. So I'll go ahead and look under my output drawer and make sure that my size is really small. And it is already by default. If it isn't, go ahead and select it and type in a small value. It could be as small as one of these could be 100, for example. 100 by 320, 100 by 300. I always want to do a small rendering first, because if there's major errors like it's dark, no reason to waste a bunch of rendering power to see that it's dark. So we start really small. Now that it's small, we'll go ahead and come into the render options, and I'll click on render. And we'll wait. Notice, of course, that the glass is the part that's taking the longest to render. OK, so just at a glance, I can look at this and I can say, it doesn't look too bad. I'm getting decent results. The sky might be a little bright. On the projector, it's showing a little bright. On my version, it's not too bad. So I'm ready to try a little bit larger rendering of this particular piece. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to go back to my Vri options here, and I'm going to look at my output size. I'm going to leave it set at override viewport. We're going to do some things where we mess with these settings a little bit. My building is really tall and not very wide. So I'm going to change my rendering. Instead of having the width be wide, I'm going to have the height be tall and the width be narrow. So we'll try one at 300 wide by, let's say, 1,000 tall. So I'm doing a rendering that's tall and skinny instead of one that's wide. So with those two set, we'll go ahead and do another rendering and see the output. I should probably save this. Let me go to Save As just in case. And instead of being called SF Downtown, let's move it onto my flash drive into today's folder. And we'll call this Skyscraper Spring 2017. OK, so now I have that. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the render. And we're going to give it a little bit of time here. So you see that suddenly my rendering is tall and skinny. But you can also see up top that I'm getting a light to dark fade, like I was talking about, on the sky. So this is not mimicking a beautiful cloudy sky, sunset, or anything like that. It's mimicking a very generic sky. But that gradient exists so that when I start to do the rendering and I start to see the reflection on my building of the surrounding buildings and of the sky, I'm getting an accurate glass-like reflection. You can already see that starting to appear. So we'll give it a little bit longer to render here. All right, so this is then the final pass. Things will tend to brighten up a little bit in the last pass. This is also probably your first taste at the speed of rendering, and that things tend to slow down when we do this. In just a second, I'm going to go through some of the options that might cause things to crash, but I wanted to at least get here. You can do a rendering of this building and wait for 5 minutes for your rendering to come out. When we get into the final project and we start to have really complicated things, or when we install other lights in the scene, or it's a nighttime rendering with 100 lights or something like that, things will get a lot slower, in which case there are strategies that we'll need to employ. For today, we don't really need to worry about those strategies. You don't need to do a network render just yet, but I will show you where those options are just so that you're aware of them. So you can see it's working its way through, and it's sharpening up as we go through. But I'm getting really good reflections on my building. And you see that I used that, remember that skyscraper glass material that I set up in the beginning with the specific size? It divides up this big glass building into segments. So it feels more like a skyscraper just with those faint lines. And that was the point of why I did something like that. There are two options of that material. Both are available for download on the course website on today's exercise. There's a dark version and a light version. I use the light version as this rendering. The dark version is going to be a little bit darker blue or darker black in terms of the glass. It's up to you what looks right. You could try them both and see which one feels right. And so I'm going to go ahead and cancel this. You guys don't need to sit here and watch this finish. The top of my building is clipped off. So in that case, I might go back to my Vri options. Under output, I might say maybe 1500 instead of, just so I get a little bit taller. There's going to be a lot of extra ground rendered because it centers the view in both directions. It's not that big a deal. So now that that's set up, we're good to go there as well. So I have those established. I told you I would show you where the network rendering is. So a couple things. You may remember from 135, when you first start up your computer, or when you first log into a computer, this thing shows up, this XML DRS spawner. And a lot of times you guys are like, whatever, and close it. Now that you're in 136, you will stop closing it. Okay? Leave it open, because what this allows people to do is, as you're working on your computer, you can borrow, like let's say I'm doing something in Illustrator, and I'm not using all of the CPU power available in my computer. Somebody else who's rendering can borrow some of that CPU power and throw it into their rendering. So it allows us to share CPU power. So we're not relying solely on our single computer. We can get some more computers. So in the process of doing that, I can enable that under my system settings. So in the Vri option editor here, I can go to System, and under Distributed Rendering, I can turn it on. Then I have to go get some hosts. I have to go get some other computers to do this. This can be sticky. It can crash on you, but remember, it's only Vri that's crashing. So all you have to do is save your file in Rhino, close it, open it again. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Find Servers, give it a little bit of time, and it's going to go look for computers that have that window open. So there's 19 unused spawners on the network. Yes, I'd like to add them now. There they are. I then have to check them, and I'll add the first 5 right now. I'll click on Resolve Servers. It gives me my correct addresses, and I'll go ahead and click OK. If I go back in, those checkboxes will stay. I could add a few more. Generally, if you add them in groups of 5, you're unlikely to crash it. If you're adding 70 at a time, it has a higher tendency of crashing. When you have those established, you can then go into your render, and we'll go ahead and render. The initial part of the rendering is a little slower. So if I were to click on the R for rendering, it's going to act a little slow in the beginning. And I may only get a few squares in the beginning. See, like right there, these are all 01A. This is my computer that's running this render. But over time, there should be a few more that will pick up. See, we can see here connected to render host. There's a bunch of other computers that I've connected to. But Vri has to send the files, the materials, my file. It has to transmit all that to the other computers in the network before they can start to join in. So we'll let it run for a little bit, and before too long, we should get a bunch more squares picked up, and that should then start the rendering process.
If your render, like another computer uses your computer?
No. You take priority over the network. So if you initiate a render, there's some complex sharing that happens in terms of if you started a render, it would allow the other render person who's, because you're giving somebody else a thread, so to speak, one of these little squares. It would allow the thread that you're giving somebody else to finish, and then it would not reallocate it back to them anymore. You would keep it for you. So right now I have, on this computer, I have 8 threads that are currently running. So initially, if somebody else was using my computer before I started rendering, and they were using one of the threads, I would only have 7 to start. And then I would pick it up as soon as their computer relinquished it. So it takes a little bit of time. As I look down here at my menu here, it's setting up the threads, and it's trying to transmit all of this information to the other computers. So it just takes a little bit of time to really get going. This is most beneficial not right now during the rendering process. It's going to be when we're in the final render and we're doing big renders with lots of complicated stuff going on. I just like to introduce it as a concept to begin. Okay? So that's available to you should you need it as part of today. The other thing that I said we would revisit is something called the Vri Proxy Object. Let me go ahead and finish this for a second there. And before I start the Vri Proxy Object, I do want to make sure I save this. So what a Vri Proxy Object does is sometimes you want to be able to work in your scene, in your Rhino scene, and not have it run super slow. The more geometry that we have in a scene, the more of this that we have, the slower Rhino is going to run. I can convert an object in Rhino into an object that is still readable and renderable by Vri, but that doesn't really exist in Rhino anymore. So it's taking an existing object in Rhino and then converting it into this special Vri format that will render only. And so I can, for example, take the SF model. I'm going to select it. Right there, it's all selected. And over here, there's a little tree icon as part of the Vri toolbars. If I right-click on that tree icon, it will allow me to write a VR mesh file. This is that Vri Proxy Object file. I want to put it on my flash drive in a folder where I know where it is. So we'll go into my flash drive, and we'll put it into today's folder. And I'm going to call this SF Vri mesh file or something like that. It'll be saved as a .vrmesh, and I'll click Save. That will then bring up this mesh file dialog box, ask me where I want to save it, which I already specified, and it also lets me choose a triangle count to preview my mesh. This mesh is going to be reduced to this number of triangles, so you're really not going to see it anymore. So that's fine. We'll just leave it as the defaults, and I'll go ahead and say OK. Now, I told you before that this was crashing on me today. So it may crash on me again. It may not crash on me. We're going to let it run for a little while and see what happens. Because if I can show it to you, I'd like to show it to you because it's a good option long term. We will use it again about, I'd say, exercise 221, 222, somewhere in there, on a smaller object, and it'll be useful there as well. But I like to introduce the concept. So we'll see if this comes back. If not, at least get me a rendering today. Again, skip the VR mesh until the end. And if you have time and you want to give it a shot, give it a shot. Do make sure you save your file in case it crashes. And the other thing to point out about a Vri mesh is you can't go back and make it an editable object. It's a one-way operation. Once it's a VR mesh, you can't go back and change it. It just exists. And that's what you trade off for the smaller file size. OK, so I'm going to let this one run for a little bit. And if it comes back, I'll call you back, and you can see it at that point. OK, so as I said before, if it didn't crash, I'd bring you back. But it didn't crash, so that's good. Must be my lucky day. So the Vri mesh was created, and it's now represented by this. So all of those buildings went away. Rhino's running a lot faster. And these random smattering of pieces represent the whole thing, which looks funny right now. But if I go back to my original view, and I go to Set View, Perspective 2, there it is, and I go to Render, all of that, all the buildings around and everything will come back into my rendering. So it's kind of a weird way of stripping out geometry. And it can be really useful and powerful down the road. But for right now, I just like to introduce it as a concept. If you want to do it, you can. If not, you can skip that step, and I'm happy. But I at least wanted to show you that the geometry will come back as part of it. All right?